Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Al Fisher. I'm a retired sociology professor from Coe College, and I will be the moderator of this morning's program, which is entitled Morality and Politicians. Beginning with the first election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980, substantial majorities of white evangelical voters have voted for Republican presidential candidates. For example, George W. Bush received 78% of the white evangelical vote, John McCain, 74%, and Mitt Romney, 78%. Moreover, the white evangelical vote is a very large one, comprising more than 25% of the electorate and well over 40% of the Republican vote. As well, about 70% of white evangelical voters have said that the personal morality of a candidate was very important to them in how they voted, and nearly 70% have said that the religious faith of a candidate was very important to them. Given this recent background, it may seem surprising that in 2016, Donald Trump received a larger share of the white evangelical vote, 81%, than any other Republican presidential candidate in the past 40 years. The journalist Tim Alberta observed in Politico, "How ironic is it that Donald Trump, of all 17 Republican candidates last year, a thrice-married Manhattan socialite and self-described womanizer with a history of running casinos and supporting partial birth abortion, who said during the campaign that he had never asked God for forgiveness because he did not need to, would become the champion of evangelical voters. How did this happen?" The journalist Robert P. Jones of the Public Research Institute has argued that in order to embrace Trump, white evangelicals have undergone a seismic shift regarding the importance they give to a candidate's morality, from a principled basis to a more utilitarian or pragmatic ethic. As recently as 2011, just 30% of white evangelicals agreed with the statement, "A political leader who committed an immoral act in his or her private life could nonetheless behave ethically and fulfill their duties in public life," while by 2016, just 5 years later, that percentage had more than doubled to 72%. In that same period, white evangelicals had shifted from being the most likely of all religious groups to say that a candidate's personal morality mattered to the least likely of all religious groups, even when one included those voters who are not religiously affiliated at all. In 1998, the evangelical leader, Reverend Pat Robertson, called President Clinton a debauched, debased, and defamed politician, while in 2016 he conducted several enthusiastic and supportive interviews with candidate Trump, and he assured Trump that, "You inspire us all." Even as evidence of Trump's past sexual assaults became public, Eric Metaxas, an evangelical writer and radio host in New York City, stated, "We all sin. To judge people by fuzzy moral standards is no longer the issue that it used to be. As long as Mr. Trump took the right positions on particular issues like immigration, terrorism, and protecting religious freedom," he averred, "it would seem that matters of personal morality were secondary. That, as Otto von Bismarck said more than a century ago, politics is the art of the possible." Today we hope to address some of the following questions. First, is it an exaggeration to say that American voters today, especially evangelical voters, are less likely to give weight to a candidate's morality or character than they have in the past, whether we're talking about personal morality, for example, Bill Clinton's sexual infidelity, or morality regarding public issues, for example, President Reagan's lying during the Iran-Contra scandal that we do not trade arms for hostages? Or is this too simplistic a dichotomy? That is, can a voter genuinely believe that even a politician of dubious personal morality can get moral policy enacted, and that is therefore desirable to vote for such a politician? And second, what kinds of moral standards do you think we ought to use in judging and electing our politicians? Here to help us shed some light on these questions are, first, Matt Hagele, Professor of Religious Studies at Kirkwood Community College; Diane Jeske, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Iowa; and Jim Leach, Professor of Law at the University of Iowa. Mr. Leach, you spent 3 decades of your life deeply immersed in American politics as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and you were widely admired as a man of principle, independence, and integrity. Do you think that over the course of your career, there has been a significant change in what voters regard as key moral issues, and in how important a candidate's personal morality and his positions on particular moral issues are to voters?
Well, as you've indicated with statistics, there was a shift this year of significance, but I would make 2 points. One, don't draw too much from a presidential race. We have these 3 levels of politics: local, state, and national. And at your local level, implicitly, people have neighborhood values. The issues of partisanship, the issues of ideology are much lower, and it's much more on a personal judgment level. Now, at the presidential level, you bet there were some difference of judgment, but part of the morality issue became a collective one. Who was most in favor of our group? And so you had kind of a moral groupthink. And I don't think that was dismissing morality, but it was putting it in a different framework. Now, having said that, there were some ironies that were quite deep, and people understand that. And so there was a second aspect of this that's gotten very little post-election review, and that is that both political parties nominated candidates that were surprisingly unpopular with large segments of the American public. And so many people felt that there were moral issues that one could look at the Democratic Party candidate just as one could look at the Republican Party candidate. And this became a factor in sticking together.
Other comments that the 2 of you would have about these issues?
Well, I think that's very right. I agree that we can't make too much out of a particular survey or a particular race, especially for the presidency. Another question in that same survey actually showed that 77% either completely or mostly agree with the claim that a politician's moral behavior is a good indication of how he or she will run in office. So there seemed to even be a conflict in the 2 questions. The one question seems to suggest that moral behavior is no longer as significant. The other seems to suggest that it is still very significant. So I agree with Jim that while maybe some had to overlook or stomach some moral qualms about the candidates of both parties, that doesn't mean that morality means nothing any longer. It just means that it had to be put into context, and I would suggest that most voters have always done that.
Okay.
I would add one other thing. When people think of morality, generally they think of traditional issues. But there became kind of a public moral issue about the direction of policy. And so you had an establishment versus anti-establishment contrast in American politics this year that was as profound as any time, at least in the last, well, at least since 1932. And Donald Trump ran as an anti-establishment candidate, as did Bernie Sanders. And Mrs. Clinton ran as the ultimate establishment candidate, and that proved to be quite disadvantageous for her, where in other elections it would have been exceptionally advantageous. And that, you might not say is exactly immoral, but economics can be moral. And the fact that we've moved in a terrific direction towards, by terrific, I don't mean this in a positive sense, towards a kind of a Gilded Age economy, with the rich getting much richer, the middle class stagnating, lower income Americans actually doing less well, has never been the average circumstance. from the early 20th century on. And this struck people as awkward. Now, there was a second dimension of it. We also had a man-made war and a man-made recession. And these were establishment wars, establishment recessions. And the country wanted to act and respond.
One phrase that often occurs in analyses of the 2016 campaign and election was that evangelicals believed that they were in a state of siege, that they were in a defensive posture vis-a-vis the rest of the culture and the culture's elites because of their religious beliefs. And though Trump might not have been, by background, equipped to deal with those, he did identify with and empathize with evangelical voters on this idea that they were being treated unfairly and they were in a state of siege. I was reminded quite a few times in the 2016 campaign of the first presidential campaign I followed very closely in 1964. I had just graduated from high school, and I went to Cleveland Public Square near my home for a campaign rally by Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton, a moderate Republican who was making an 11th hour unsuccessful bid to head off the nomination from Barry Goldwater. And I remember standing on the edge of the crowd but being besieged by proverbial little old ladies in tennis shoes with Goldwater buttons who would wag their fingers in my face and say, unless Goldwater is elected, or if Johnson is elected, this will be the last free election we'll ever see in this country. And I thought there were quite a few temperamental affinities between the Goldwater campaign then and the Trump campaign in 2016, with the key difference that Trump followers, in part for economic reasons and in part for religious reasons, seem to be much more numerous, and whereas Goldwater got pretty thoroughly slaughtered at a time of economic prosperity.
And just briefly on that campaign, what's interesting is that it was really the far right, perhaps, of the so-called evangelicals, the fundamentalists, who were supportive of Goldwater, and tying it to the morality issue. Here's Goldwater, who was often using a lot of profanity. He chose a Catholic running mate, which very much would have angered the fundamentalists and even many evangelicals at that time. So there's another instance where some members of the so-called white evangelical community in some ways were able to overlook certain things that, morally speaking, usually would have bothered them in order to support Goldwater, even though most northern evangelicals, Billy Graham and others, seemed ambivalent or supportive of Johnson in that race.
Even late in his career, Goldwater maintained his salty style, which didn't endear him to evangelicals sometimes. I remember he was asked during the ascension of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell what he thought of Jerry Falwell, and he said, "I'd like to kick him in the ass." And the august, ever so genteel New York Times said, Mr. Goldwater said he would like to kick Mr. Falwell in the posterior. But anybody who followed Goldwater's career knows that wasn't the way.
Beyond that, I mean, this really shows the evolution of the Republican Party. Barry Goldwater was an individual rights Republican, and he was pro-choice and pro-gay rights. Which would have put him today in the leftist part of the Republican Party.
Diane, you were about to jump in?
Well, and I think also when we think about morality, of course, what the evangelicals are going to think of as the most significant moral issues might not be what others think of as the most significant moral issues. It struck me after the tapes were released of Donald Trump's comments about how he assaulted women. The first I heard of it, I thought, that's it, he's done. But I think that the evangelicals haven't always been the most progressive on women's issues, to say the least. And to me, that was was a much more serious sort of comment than sexual infidelity with a consenting partner. I'm not saying that I'm going to discount that entirely, but I think there's always been a strain among evangelicals, the anti-feminism and so forth, that probably at some level wasn't all that opposed to this very dismissive rejection of women. And so I think that it's hard to say that aligning with Trump, they weren't voting on moral standards. I think it's indicative of perhaps of what they think is significant morally.
Right. One commentator noted that the continuities over 40 or 50 years were probably just as great as the discontinuities as far as evangelical political convictions were concerned. And one of the examples they gave was that evangelicals, like Concerned Women for America, led the charge successfully against the Equal Rights Amendment.
Right.
So, Professor Hagele, you identify as some of your main areas of scholarly interest the intersections between religion, philosophy, and politics, and religious forms of reasoning and democratic discourse. How might the intersections between religion and politics have changed in the past decade or so, and how have religious forms of reasoning changed, particularly as they're expressed by voters and especially by evangelical voters? I know you've touched on these already.
Sure. Well, there are still some in America that would like to see a much more radical silencing of religious forms of reasoning in public discourse, a much more radical privatization of religious commitments. And yet, I think if anything that we've learned in the last 2 decades is that religion maintains its sense of being a real force in American democratic discourse. It's always kind of difficult to know exactly how much those religious commitments are informing voters. Very interesting poll was taken before or at the time of this last presidential election. And when you asked evangelical pastors about the issues that were most meaningful to them, they would rank something like personal character very highly, and many of them were very opposed to Donald Trump's candidacy. When you actually look at the evangelical voters themselves, the personal morality issue, even the Supreme Court issue, ranked relatively low, and it was more about jobs and the economy, well, we're always told, right? So it's always difficult to know exactly how much the religious forms of reasoning are really influencing most voters, but I think there is still definitely a role for religion in public discourse for many voters. And as many writers have said, despite Donald Trump's seeming inability to really speak what one writer called Christianese, he kept trying, like you said. He kept trying to show that empathy. Whereas this writer, Ruth Graham, said Hillary Clinton seemed like somebody who never took the Rosetta Stone software out of the shrink wrap. She never wanted to engage at all, right? Not only did she refuse an interview with Christianity Today, she was perhaps the first candidate to not even return their call. So there was a lot of those issues as well that really created a sense for a lot of white evangelicals that their vote was not so much pro-Trump as it was anti-Hillary. The first thing I hear is, well, consider the alternative, and that has to be kept in mind.
Which seems oddly ironic and foolish to me, because it seems to me there is good evidence that Hillary Clinton's political views, despite her ethical indiscretions, her political views, I think, have been profoundly shaped by her Methodist background.
And teaching Bible study courses in the Methodist churches in her background as well. You know, her campaign was certainly rebuked by many in Obama's campaigns for that silence in trying to reach out, which Obama did, and was maybe enough to secure a greater vote within that block for him.
But you're right,
but it is surprising.
She acted as though it's something you shouldn't mention in polite company.
It seems like it, and that's still some of that voice that maybe we consider back to someone like John Rawls that maybe seeks a greater silencing of religious forms of reasoning in the public. But I don't think that's been ultimately successful, despite maybe some regulations and setbacks along the way.
Professor Jeske, you identify ethics and social policy as one of your key areas of scholarly interest. What issues of ethics and social policy do you think voters and candidates ought to care about more than they do today? And how do you think they should try to influence public officials to make social policy more ethical? For example, it's often been pointed out that while there's an almost obsessive talking about the needs of the middle class, there is very, very little. In fact, I think John Edwards is about the last candidate I can think of who made an issue of poverty. Are there ethical concerns that you think politicians and voters ought to be more aware of and assertive about?
You know, it's really ironic that you say that Edwards was the last person to take poverty so seriously. And What I find really interesting when you talk about religious forms of reasoning in the public arena is that it's not clear to what extent they're genuinely drawing upon their own religious faith. I mean, if you read the New Testament, there should be a great emphasis on poverty and addressing the poor. But unfortunately, it is groupthink and questions about who's going to benefit us, who's sympathetic to us. But I think that the biggest issue facing us now has to do with how we reason at all, or if we reason at all in the public domain. I think we've ceased doing it. We throw slogans at each other. Presidential debates weren't debates. It was humiliating as an American to watch that. But I think the difficulty is that you need to be educated to recognize where arguments are lacking. And we're in a time, not only federally, but particularly in the state of Iowa, where cuts to education are very serious, very dramatic. Cuts to research. A lot of public policy issues now depend on very complicated empirical questions in the sciences and technology. And the less research we do, the less information we have. There's been a devaluing of expertise in the United States. If you show somebody who's got a PhD or a degree, they're immediately suspicious. We somehow want people from the outside telling us how to do things. So I think we're at a point where unless people start genuinely caring about education, not just as a means to getting a job, but to having a well-educated citizenry who can evaluate what their candidates are saying, then, I mean, I don't think people in the last election even were clear who was going to promote their interest. It shocked me how many people in the lower middle classes thought Trump was really pushing their interests. And so I think we're in a very, very dangerous situation where we have a populace who's bombarded with information on the internet, unable to evaluate the information, and we're making cuts to the areas of education and research, and the dialogue's just going to get less and less intelligent.
One of the more discouraging pair of data that I've ever seen as an educator was in a book by a Harvard political scientist published about 15 years ago titled The Vanishing American Voter. And Professor Patterson argued convincingly and had quite a lot of data to support this, that voters with no more than a high school diploma knew more about the issues and the candidates in the 1948 presidential election than voters with a bachelor's degree or above knew in the 2000 election. Is that because even though we're marinated in information, much of it is misinformation? And would you also say, as people steeped in the knowledge of ethics, that there has been a comparable, I don't like the phrase dumbing down, but a comparable erosion of skills in ethical analysis, just as there appears to have been erosion of factual knowledge of politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we live in a culture of sound bites, of web pages where you move from one to another as soon as you're bored. Another danger is, of course, that with the internet you can seek out sites where everybody agrees with you and you get your opinion validated. You don't like what you're hearing, well, you go to another site or you unfriend somebody, or you post some terrible, nasty thing on a bulletin board somewhere on the internet. I do think that we need to have debates where people actually focus and pay attention. And I don't think that we have a culture with the internet and so forth that is, I mean, just think about tweets. Donald Trump now, how much he uses Twitter. What do you get on Twitter? How many characters can you get to a tweet?
140.
140, there you go. That's not a way to be talking about serious issues. It's not a way to really be talking about much of anything. But, so I mean, I think there's a real danger. I mean, I know my students now write more and more in the language of Twitter and internet postings. And I think that's a very dangerous situation.
What steps do you think we could take to make our political rhetoric more constructive, more substantive, and less toxic?
I think you can begin with how elections are run. And we are seeing an enormous change in American public life with the intervention of money in politics being exaggerated. And for the first time, the great balancing institution in American society, the Supreme Court of the United States, in my view, has truly erred in the Citizens United ruling, which is moving in America in a corporatist direction. And so citizens increasingly, and in a way correctly, have concluded that their voices don't count as much. And then if you take 1948 to 2000, because you mentioned some statistical differentiations, society is vastly more complicated with vastly different challenges in how one spends one's time and options of what one is interested in. And people are turned off by a government that isn't accountable to them in their own perceptions. And by government, I'm not talking about either political party, just government itself at the national level. And you ask what are they interested in? They care about their home state football team, basketball team. They care about a lot of cultural things. The people with the latest songs and the great involvement and great interest in America in automobile racing. I mean, this is a major culture. And so you say to someone, would you like to listen to a politician give a talk? And they look at you cross-eyed. It's not meaningful to them. And that doesn't mean we don't have a smarter populace, and we clearly do. In fact, my personal view is America has never had greater leadership in almost every aspect of society, with the leading exception being politics, where leadership is not as strong as it once was. And that is particularly true the higher up one goes. If you take Cedar Rapids, Iowa, this town has a surprisingly effective government. And it's not bogged down in ideology and partisanship. There are personalities. There's always on a city council someone slightly out of step with other people. That can be wise. It can be less than wise. Everywhere. But people know what's happening. And they don't understand all these substantial things at the national level.
We're down to just 1 minute, so do you have any kind of closing statement or observation you'd like to make?
Well, maybe just quickly, I think, the idea that maybe we have lacked the ability now to engage in real moral reasoning, I think is very important. Alistair McIntyre said that we are living in an age after virtue. And for him, a lot of it is the erosion of traditions and communities that help to inculcate virtue. And I think that may be one other area where we need to see a bit of a change in American society in order to get back to real moral reasoning.
Diane?
Well, I would certainly agree with that, and I think that we need to learn how to talk civilly between people of various religious persuasions and people who don't accept any kind of religion at all, deciding which beliefs are relevant to which sorts of policies.
Okay. Matt, Diane, Jim, thank you very much for your astute observations.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience this morning. Thank you.